Hello and welcome to the Haaretz Podcast. I'm Alison Kaplan-Summer in Tel Aviv. Sirens have become the soundtrack to life in Israel as the conflict with Iran continues and intensifies. The U.S. and Israel continue to launch non-stop air attacks in Iran, including targeting their top leadership. Israel recently assassinated both Iranian intelligence minister Esmail Khatib and security chief Ali Larijani. The Israeli military has escalated its attacks on Lebanon on Wednesday with strikes in Beirut and other cities, while Israeli troops continued a deeper ground invasion into the south, targeting Hezbollah. Israel continues to pay a high price for the 2.5-week-long offensive launched in conjunction with the United States as missiles rain on the country, taking a toll on both life and property. On Tuesday night this week, a 70-year-old couple was killed when a cluster bomb exploded in the center of their living room in the Tel Aviv suburb of Ramat Gan before they were able to take shelter in a safe room. But despite the costs, despite the sleepless nights, Israelis continue to support the war in overwhelming numbers, according to surveys. Meanwhile, in the United States, President Donald Trump is struggling to find similar support in his country, even among his base. Joining me on the podcast to talk about public opinion, the support and lack of it for the war in both countries, and its effect on the political fates of Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, is Haaretz columnist and political analyst Dr. Dahlia Scheindlin. In addition to writing for Haaretz, she is the author of The Crooked Timber of Democracy in Israel, Promise Unfulfilled. My conversation with Dahlia is coming up.
I'm Esther Solomon, Editor-in-Chief of Haaretz English. Around the world, the fight is on to preserve critical and independent media. Haaretz, Israel's oldest newspaper, upholds its long tradition of accurate, committed, and incisive journalism, refusing to bend its reporting to pressure from any government or leader. A digital subscription to Haaretz gives you up-to-the-minute news and analysis in English from journalists who live Israel's reality and are committed to covering the Middle East and its global repercussions.
Dr. Dahlia Scheindlin, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, as always.
Dahlia, you don't have to be a public opinion expert or understand polls very well to figure out that the current conflict in Iran is an unusually unpopular war in the United States. And at the same time, in Israel, even though most of our wars start with an unusually high level of support, considering what the home front is going through right now, the level of public support for the war is extremely high, impressively high, I would think. My first simple question to you is, why the gap? Is it just as basic as the fact that Israelis view this as an existential war and Americans don't view Iran as a direct threat to their safety, to their well-being, and it's a war of choice? Is it because of the success of the Netanyahu messaging machine in Israel?
I don't think it's just about messaging. I think that Israelis look at Iran and its influence on the region and, what more or less accurately see the most threatening actors who are directly attacking Israel, right? Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis. Let's say, Hezbollah and the Houthis only since October 7th, but Hamas, Israel for a long time. They see them all as in the orbit of Iran. Now, how much Hamas is directly influenced by Iran is something for policymakers and experts to wrangle over, but Israelis see that Iran has this influence. Of course, Israelis also tend to minimize any role that the occupation plays in any of this violence. And so, in the reductionist Israeli approach, which I do think is something that Netanyahu has tried very hard to convey, and in general, the Israeli right wing, that Iran is the source of all that threatens Israel. Iran is the source of all instability in the Middle East. Iran is the source of religious fundamentalism and a dangerous version of Islam. And if we just get Iran under control, so much will be better. You've heard Israelis saying this for the last few weeks. We can take care of Iran, and this will mean our lives are peaceful for a very long time to come. But it comes from attributing those very real attacks on Israel primarily to the underlying source, which is Iran. Now, Americans don't have anything equivalent. There has been no physical attacks on America, from Iran directly, for a very long time, let's say. And even those were rather indirect. For For Americans, Iran has been on the public agenda, let's say more prominently since the talks over the JCPOA in 2015. And, it was a big policy issue. But before that, Americans could kind of take it or leave it. They didn't really have to think about Iran very much. It's very far away. Again, the threat wasn't so immediate and active. And even the JCPOA for most average Americans was just one more foreign policy issue, certainly not nearly as prominent as Iraq, where America was actively at war for a very long time. So it makes sense that Americans just aren't as attuned to it. Add to that the fact that there is, a majority of Americans at the beginning of this war, according to surveys, did not think that President Trump had explained the reasons why he was getting involved in this war so actively, whereas a majority of Israelis thought that the aims of the war and Israel's role in the war were very clear because they had been told for all these years that only military action against Iran can contain them. And so that I think that, the reasons for the gap are pretty clear. And then the question is, internally within America, who supports it, who is opposed to it? And there we have major partisan breakdowns. Whereas in Israel, I should say support for the war cuts across partisan lines.
Let's put it in the numbers, Dahlia. That's what you do. Exactly how much public support does the assault on Iran in conjunction with the United States have among the Israeli public?
So there is a major division within the Israeli public between Jewish and Arab or Palestinian citizens of Israel poll respondents. And what we see is that there is overwhelming support among the Jewish population. It is frankly a consensus in survey terms. We're talking about 93% of Israeli Jews in the first week of the war, according to polls by the Israel Democracy Institute. The Israel Democracy Institute did another poll in the second week of the war, and they found the exact same number among Israeli Jews. Among the Arab Palestinian population of Israel, support is much lower. It's barely at a quarter. And in fact, there's about 2/3 who oppose this war, which is a very typical dynamic for Palestinian citizens of Israel who generally, on pretty much any front, will support peaceful approaches and oppose military escalation. So that's a very typical divide. I should say there's been one change that I've noticed. Well, for one thing, surveys by the Institute for National Security Studies have shown somewhat lower support, but still quite a consensus. We're talking 78, 81%. That's been their range. So it's similar, but a little bit, tiny bit lower than the Israel Democracy Institute. What I will say is that there's been a slight change among the Jewish population between those two surveys that I mentioned by the Israel Democracy Institute, and that is in the level of intensity. So in the first survey, there was, over 60% who very intensively supported the war, and that declined by about 6 or 7 points in the second one. So the overall number is the same, but I think it does indicate some shifts in the enthusiasm for doing it as Israelis are getting worn down on the home front, as you say. And there are some other indicators as well about how much they really believe the war can achieve its most far-reaching goals, which were, built up by the leadership in the beginning where Netanyahu was talking about regime change. Well, the number of Israelis who believe that there can be regime change or toppling, the Iranian revolutionary regime, it has been dropping also.
So it's particularly striking, a contradiction that I've noticed in two different columns that you wrote in Haaretz. On one hand, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is getting high marks from the Israeli public for the way he is managing this war. And yet, in your latest Haaretz column, you say that polling so far indicates no good news for the country's current ruling coalition, that he's reaping no political benefit from the satisfactory performance that the Israeli public thinks he's doing on the war. So how do you square that circle?
Yeah, I think that, first of all, we haven't seen the end of this yet, right? We don't know where public opinion dynamics are going to go over the next few weeks or months. But I will say that for a very long time, Netanyahu's personal ratings in terms of how much the public trusts him, in his head-to-head competition with other leaders, the poll ratings for the Likud and for the coalition government have been flat and stuck. And he does not have a majority. In other words, even in his best polling indicator, which is the head-to-head matchups, who's best suited to be prime minister, where he usually comes in first, we still only have about 40% on average who want him to be prime minister versus somebody else. Why? Because, first of all, there's a large chunk of Israelis who choose neither option, whether it's Netanyahu against Gantz or Netanyahu against Lapid or Netanyahu against Bennett. And I think that his ceiling of support really is in the low 40% range. That's also the same number that the coalition parties are getting altogether. So when we ask a simulated election question in surveys, the current coalition is only getting between roughly 49 to 53 or 54 seats. That translates into percentage-wise into just in the low 40% range. That is pretty much the ceiling for Netanyahu's government. And what we're seeing since the war began in Iran is that his numbers went up just a tiny bit in terms of the straightforward question about how much you trust him. So this is also the Institute for National Security Studies polling. They found that 38% say they trust Netanyahu. Again, very close to that 40% average. That was a 4-point rise from their survey the last time they asked that question before the Iran war. So it is a tiny lift, but nothing like you would see in a wartime rally. And it's consistent with this ceiling that I've been seeing in surveys for Netanyahu, the party, and the coalition. However, when the same surveys asked, do you trust Netanyahu to handle this war? That's where you see in Israel Democracy Institute polling, 64% of the Israeli public, that's an average, so much higher even among the Jewish population, said, yes, we trust him. In another media survey, 53% said they trust him. So you can get these variations. But again, it's a majority who say that they trust Netanyahu's handling of the war with Iran. Now, that is because the case had been so strongly built. We have this overwhelming support for the war itself and the fact that he initiated it and is doing it and is showing strength in the Middle East and convinced America to do it with him. That's seen as a massive success. And I think most Israelis have become convinced that Iran needed to be attacked militarily.
But Dahlia, it's interesting that he has that kind of credibility and trust in wartime because he said, the goals of the war with Gaza was to, destroy Hamas and make them lay down their weapons and get rid of the Hamas leadership. And that didn't happen. And he said that we totally decimated Hezbollah's capabilities in Lebanon. And we're seeing now that they've got plenty of capabilities left. So there's no fool me once, fool me twice here. The public has full faith in his ability to achieve the goals in Iran, or at least most of the goals in Iran, despite the fact that they've had evidence over the past 2.5 years that what he says isn't necessarily what's going to happen.
It's a very good question. I think that, first of all, there's a really fundamental division between what happened in Gaza and against Hamas versus the other ones, because the other ones are seen as these external threats and Israelis completely disconnect them from the Palestinian issue. Now, October 7th was considered the government's biggest failure. No matter what happened in the war with Hamas, no matter how much the government tried to say it had achievements, it will always be connected with that failure. And so people see the failures of the war, and it was bad for Netanyahu until he started escalating in response to the attacks from other parts of the Middle East. His ratings remained far worse than they are now. But when it comes to Hezbollah and Iran, yes, it's true, he overstated, absolutely, the gains. But people liked that he escalated with Hezbollah to begin with in September of 2024 because it was a response to Hezbollah having joined the fight on October 8th. And they thought, this has to be done. You hear this sentence a lot from Israelis, this is what has to be done. And I think that even if the exact goals aren't achieved, the conclusion, certainly let's take the case of Hezbollah. The northern residents now are very angry. They're living under massive amounts of barrages and it's dangerous and they can barely live a normal. It's worse than it is for us in the center of the country. And so many people are saying we were lied to. The government told us that they had destroyed Hezbollah. But I think that their response is, that means we need to attack more. It's never a matter of let's use diplomacy. If war didn't work the first time, that means we have to go back to war. And now the government's doing it. So that is satisfying to that kind of sensibility. And the other thing is, again, the fact that he's just doing the right thing. Okay, even if all those goals can't be achieved, to their mind, it's still the right thing to be done. So I know those are kind of related. Maybe they even overlap. But that, I think, is the attitude. And it's the same with Iran, really. I think people in a very primal way like the show of strength, and the image that Israel is taking the initiative back on security, is escalating in the Middle East, is taking its security into its own hands. I think everything to do with Gaza will always be tainted by the sense that it was a response to a failure, even if all the goals of the Iran war can't be achieved. And we see the change in surveys. People are accepting that, for example, Israel may not be able to topple the regime. But they still think that this massive military assault is going to have very significant effects of setting, everything else back, the nuclear program, the ballistic missile program, and that Israel will be safer.
Mowing the grass, basically, as we call it in the Middle East. If you can't get rid of the threat, then just continue to go back again and again and again and reduce it, which is what the northern residents of Israel are very unhappy about. But it just seems like the same sort of process.
Well, I think that from analysts who are looking at it, that is the fear, because that's what we are seeing in practice. And at this point, there have been 2 rounds of limited exchanges of fire with Iran and 2 full-out wars. So we are looking at this as analysts and seeing that. But I think that the reason why the public is supporting this so strongly is that I think there's this hope that this is going to be the big war that achieves some sort of quiet for Israel for a very long time. So I'm conjuring the public view of this. My view, of course, is that it's going to turn into a series of forever wars, mowing the grass. But more than mowing the grass, I think the bigger fear that I have is it's going to turn into something like the First Lebanon War, which leads to an ongoing 18-year low-level occupation of some sort. I don't know if it's going to be a real occupation on the ground in Iran, but something like that. Either way, I think the public support right now is so high, not so much because they're seeing a mowing the grass concept, but because they are hoping that these 2 wars together against Hezbollah and against Iran will be the wars to end all wars, at least for a long time.
Well, your fellow columnist at Haaretz, our colleague Joshua Leffer, has another analogy. He just put it in very stark terms in his latest column. He wrote, "A military quagmire and geopolitical debacle. Israel's long set of post-October 7th wars risk becoming Netanyahu's Vietnam." What do you think of that?
It's basically what I was just saying about Lebanon. I would say, I mean, it's the same concept. My model for it is less Vietnam, but only because why look so far away? Israel has its own Vietnam, and 18 years is a very long time. When the occupation of Lebanon was bleeding the country dry, it was sort of a slow drip of death. And Israelis still have bad memories about that. And that's why in the most recent survey by the Institute for National Security Studies that was just published yesterday, only 39% of Israelis, on average, want to see Israel establish a permanent, security zone in Lebanon.
As we record, we've got our ground forces making a major incursion into Lebanon.
Right. And so that's the Lebanon case. But I'm saying, it's hard to envision what this will mean in Iran, but I think there could be some equivalent of Israel getting bogged down in a quagmire that, again, it's perfectly fine to compare it to Vietnam. I would just say that for the more prominent example is much closer to home for Israel and not nearly so long ago. I mean, it's true that Lebanon, that occupation ended 26 years ago, but that's still very fresh in the minds of anybody old enough to remember and in the collective memory of people who are too young to remember it themselves, but have heard the stories very directly, much more than Vietnam, which I think, strangely doesn't feature so strongly in Israeli thinking about this, certainly not among the public, and I don't know to what extent among the military establishment, but I'm guessing that the political establishment just is brushing it all off and saying if we have to be permanent occupiers, that's good because it allows them to think about expansion in cosmic terms, given who this government is, full of religious fundamentalists.
So switching sides of the globe, things are looking okay, but not so great for Netanyahu. They're looking kind of bad for Donald Trump right now in terms of his politics. Again, he's not running for anything, so, his political future or the political map in the United States. But Americans are not happy with what he's doing in Iran. The U.S. is coming up to elections, but midterm elections, and Trump doesn't seem too worried about them right now, or at least about the cracks in his Republican base over the war. You write that may be a little bit overblown, the cracks in the Republican base over the war?
I think there are 2 things that are, again, both of these are developing stories, but what we're seeing in surveys in the first week of the war was that this much hyped sense of a MAGA split over the Iran war, which made a lot of sense, right? Because Trump did portray himself as the person who was going to bring peace. I spoke to American voters just around the time of the elections who said, I'm voting for him primarily because he's going to bring peace. And then he wanted the Nobel Prize, and he talks about his 8 conflicts that he didn't resolve, but he says he did. And to be making war, I mean, it's the second time now that he really took an aggressive action against another sovereign country. It made sense that there would be a MAGA split, but the polls didn't show it. The polls are showing overwhelming support from Republican voters in general. We're talking between 3/4 and, close to 80%, which is very similar. But that is considered an overwhelming majority in survey terms. Again, maybe it'll change, certainly as the elites of the MAGA movement, these influential voices like Nick Fuentes and Joe Rogan and Tucker Carlson, you would think that would sink in. along with the prices of gas, that are costing Americans and particularly his voters. So it could be that over the next few weeks, we will see cracks, but I haven't seen them yet in the second week of polling.
So it's utterly partisan. Love Trump means that the war is okay because Trump's doing it. Hate Trump, hate the war. And because Trump's not so popular at the moment, or he wasn't really as the war started, the war's not so popular? Pretty
much. And you can tell, first of all, that is how the surveys break down on the question of do you support the action in Iran, military action in Iran. The other thing is that if you look at the support in surveys, in American surveys asking, do you approve or disapprove of Trump's handling of Iran? It is basically mirrors exactly his approval ratings in general. So it's not like people think about him differently on Iran, which is different from what I just mentioned and argued about the polls in Israel, where people do are more likely to trust Netanyahu on Iran, even if they don't support him at the polls. For Trump, it seems to be very overlapping. The other dynamic that I've seen between the first and the second and third week, or the first two waves of polls that are coming out in the U.S. about the Iran war, is that support is growing slightly and opposition is declining slightly. So in the beginning, in the first week, we had polls showing that over 50%, a clear majority of Americans, even if not a huge majority, but usually double the number opposed it in America than those who support it, or roughly double. What we're seeing in recent polling is a more even split in Washington Post polling and a couple of others that I've been tracking. And so I think that I'm keeping my eye on it. It's a little too new to say if that's completely a trend, but there are more than one tracking surveys showing a more even split now. And
can you think of an explanation why over time the support would even out or grow, or the opposition would reduce?
Well, I mean, some of this is really not the typical pattern we'd see. Again, usually in the beginning of war, we see a rally effect, which is what we're seeing in Israel for the war. But I think in America, because Trump is so controversial, it could have been that it started out completely partisan, but that as time goes by, even though it's still a very short time, right? We're still only talking about, 19 days now, roughly. It could be that Americans are having a delayed rally. Like, if our country's doing this, we better support it, right? The kind of wartime effect that you normally see in the beginning, maybe that was suppressed because Trump himself overshadows the policy so much, but that over the last 2.5 weeks or so, some people are changing their minds, apparently.
Could it be the factor of the Iranian exile, the Iranian diaspora expressing support for the war?
I doubt it, because that's still a very tiny portion of the population in the U.S., and I don't know how influential they really are for the entire American public. But I do think that the broader American public is probably getting maybe a slow build of a wartime rallying effect, even if it's still very moderate, right? And I say that cautiously because we do have to wait for another, I would say, several more surveys to see if it's really a trend.
We're still pretty far away from the midterms, but there are some important primaries happening. Do you think this is at all going to influence the prosecution of the war, the worry about the effect on the voting in the midterms?
I have very little way to judge that, because Trump is not a typical president who cares about the fate of his party. I did hear former Israeli ambassador to the U.S., Michael Oren, give a podcast interview in which he said he doesn't think Trump has any interest or care or concern for the fate of the Republican Party in the midterms or in the next presidential election. And so I imagine Michael Oren has greater insight into how Trump thinks than I do, but I don't know if anybody really knows his mind. Though I guess it's very hard to say that Trump is, he didn't even grow out of the Republican Party. We have no reason to think that that is really his concern. And so I don't know to what extent Trump will really change his mind because of polling, and particularly because of what I noticed before, which I assume his advisors noticed as well. And that is the overwhelming support among Republican voters for his policy because it's him doing it.
Well, you can always just say that the midterms are rigged by Iran, right?
He probably will if his candidates don't do well.
So, Dahlia, we've covered the United States and we've covered Israel. What about the rest of the world? We know what leaders are saying across Western Europe, internationally. We're seeing how Russia, China are reacting to the war and the situation. Do we have any kind of read on what the public around the world, particularly in sort of key countries, are thinking about this war?
I don't have fresh data on this, but I think that it's safe to assume that most of the public is very deeply alarmed by the ongoing sort of a rolling series of fresh wars in the Middle East. And Israel has been blamed for a lot of that over the last 2 years, even though, of course, much of the world really was horrified by October 7th, but certainly feel that after, polling was showing after a very, fairly short time that Israel had used up that credit and was prolonging the war. I think there was a very strong attitude, certainly in Western Europe, that Israel was prolonging the war, that Netanyahu was prolonging it for his own political purposes with no real aim in sight and no justification, and really just abusing Gazans and destroying them. And so that is quite a widespread view, I think, and certainly in European publics. And I think that this to them, again, I'm going not so much on numbers as my reading of a broad Western European mindset, which I do distinguish from the Eastern European countries because they do have, a fundamental divide within the European Union over their attitudes towards Israel in general. But I think this is seen as part of America kind of breaking the entire post-war rules-based order, right? Because America simply started a war. So they see it as a war of aggression. On the other hand, the European leaders, it's interesting because European leaders have been somewhat more understanding, right? There is no justification. You don't hear any defense of Iran in this situation. You hear a lot of, kind of understanding that Iran was an aggressive actor, et cetera, but that America should follow international law.
On the other hand, they're not exactly rushing to the Straits of Hormuz to help Trump out when he's asking for it.
Not exactly, but there are some countries that are more willing to, make their bases available, for example, than others. It's a little bit different from how they saw Gaza, right? Gaza, it was so easy after a few months, and there probably was good reason to blame Israel for continuing the war and doing things that seemed unjustified even after October 7th. But I think that it's a little more complicated because, again, the European elites are not quite as solid about, viewing America and Israel as purely aggressive actors. They don't defend Iran. They think the regime is bad. And so I think the public may be a little bit less kind of fired up about this, but I do think that it looks, for the most part, in European countries like, again, America and Israel, escalating and starting wars in the Middle East that are likely to continue to a chain reaction of further wars. So I would be concerned that that is going to be the lingering view in public opinion as well.
Dr. Dahlia Scheindlin, I have to say your analysis was really interesting, spot on, and you sound very articulate and wide awake despite the broken nights that you're getting in Tel Aviv.
That's funny because I don't feel like that, but I will say that these are the questions that I have been asked quite a lot over the last number of weeks. Of course, because I've been writing about it, but I think also because everybody wants to know what this means for Netanyahu. Really, where is society on this stuff? So it's true that I have been honing these ideas, and I keep trying to update with new information as I have it and as I see it and as I try to understand it. But no, I do not at all feel rested or sharp. So thank you.
You can conduct little surveys in each bomb shelter, right? Every time you go to a different public bomb shelter, see how the Israeli public is feeling.
I have thought about that because I feel like it would be a classic thing for me to do. I love chatting with people on the street. I shamelessly chat with taxi drivers, and I call it qualitative research. But in the shelters, I think that, I do go to a communal shelter because I don't have a shelter in my building, and half of my block goes to a building that is 2 doors down, so we all congregate there. And I think that I have refrained from that, partly because a lot of this is in the middle of the night and I'm tired and I sit up against the wall and try to doze. But even during the day, there's a camaraderie. People sort of enjoy each other and they comfort each other just by being a little bit lighthearted. And I think that I feel like it's a little bit unfair to, and I would know how to do it. I know how to sort of drop something in the conversation that seems innocent, but obviously opens up the door to this stuff. And I think that it's a little unfair. I'd rather people just talk naturally and do what makes them feel comfortable because people are really scared at these times. And I think we've done a pretty good job in my particular community shelter of keeping each other sort of as calm as possible. And I just feel like it would be a little disrespectful to, kind of sabotage that with drawing people into political conversations. Having said that, occasionally a word or two arises, but for the most part, I content myself with trying to remember the names of all the cute little dogs who come down to the shelter with us.
That sounds much more pleasant than doing a political survey. Dr. Dahlia Scheindlin, thank you so much for coming on, as always. And in those communal shelters that you're not using as focus groups, please stay safe.
Thank you. I'll try. You too.
And that wraps up this episode of the Haaretz Podcast. Thanks to my guest, Dr. Dahlia Scheindlin, and to producer and editor Adi Shacham. If you'd like to continue to listen to the podcast and never miss an episode, don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple, on Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're so inclined, leave a comment and leave us a 5-star rating, and that way more people can find us. And to keep up with all the latest news on the Iran war, as well as all of the news on Israel, the Middle East, and the Jewish world, don't forget to subscribe to and follow Haaretz.com. I'm Alison Kaplan-Summer, and until next time, shalom from Tel Aviv.